Working on radio in Malabo was never just a job for me, it was a rhythm that shaped my mornings, my voice traveling through the humid coastal air of the city and into taxis, kitchens, offices and fishing boats returning from the Gulf of Guinea. The station where I worked was one of the biggest private radios in the country, a place where music, laughter, politics and whispers of scandal mixed together in a constant stream of sound. My name on air was known across the city. People would greet me in markets and along Avenida de la Independencia, telling me they listen every morning while preparing coffee or waiting in traffic. I love that invisible connection, the sense that somewhere beyond the glass window of the studio thousands of lives were listening and feeling the same pulse of the city with me. My husband was also part of the world of voices and news. He was a journalist on the national television channel, a serious man respected for his calm delivery and careful reporting. In public, we looked like the perfect media couple of Malabo, two journalists who had built a life out of microphones, cameras and the endless hunger for stories. Our apartment overlooked the sea, and in the evenings we would sit on the balcony watching the orange sunset fade over the water while talking about the news of the day. At least that was how it used to be in the early years, when our conversations were full of excitement and our laughter filled the small rooms of our home. But time is strange and quiet in the way it changes things. Little silences grow between people and responsibilities turn passion into routine. My husband spent more and more nights preparing reports or traveling with government delegations, and I spent more and more hours at the station hosting longer segments and special interviews. Sometimes we crossed paths like colleagues rather than lovers, exchanging polite smiles before rushing back to our work. The city outside our window never slept, and neither did they. Media world. We belonged to. One rainy afternoon, the station manager told me I would host a special interview with the head of the National Financial Investigation Agency, a man whose name had been appearing often in the news because of several high-profile investigations. His name was Balitazoli, and he had the reputation of being both brilliant and intimidating. People described him as a man who could read a financial report the way a detective reads a crime scene. I prepared carefully, reading everything I could about the agency and the cases they were working on. The day he arrived at the station, the clouds over Malabo were heavy and the streets were shining from the rain. When he walked into the building, he carried himself with a calm confidence that made the room feel quieter. He was taller than I expected, dressed simply yet with the presence of someone used to being listened to. When we shook hands, I noticed his eyes studying the studio with curiosity, as if he was entering a different kind of investigation, one made of microphones and music instead of documents and numbers. During the broadcast, our conversation flowed easily. I asked him about corruption investigations, about the challenges of financial transparency, and about the future of Equatorial Guinea's institutions. He answered with patience and occasional humor, surprising the technicians behind the glass who had expected a cold bureaucrat. Several times he smiled at something I said, and I felt a strange awareness that our professional exchange had a layer of energy beneath it, something unspoken but present. After the program ended, we continued talking in the hallway. The rain had stopped and the warm evening light filtered through the station windows. He thanked me for the interview, saying it was the most relaxed conversation he had had with the media in months. I laughed and told him radio had a way of making people forget their defenses because there were no cameras, only voices and imagination. He seemed to like that explanation, and before leaving he asked if I ever hosted discussions about financial education or public accountability, because he believed those topics deserved more attention. That question started a series of meetings that were supposed to be professional. Sometimes he would come to the station to plan future segments about economic awareness, and sometimes we would meet in quiet cafes around the city to discuss ideas for programs that could explain complex financial issues to ordinary listeners. Every conversation began with work, yet gradually drifted into other territories: stories about childhood memories in different provinces, reflections on the changes Malabo had gone through during the last decade, and the strange pressure of living in public roles where everyone believed they understood your life. I noticed that he listened carefully when I spoke, in a way that made me feel seen again. It had been a long time since someone looked at me not as a radio personality or a journalist wife, but simply as a woman with thoughts, doubts, and ambitions. Sometimes when I returned home after those meetings, I would sit on the balcony and watch the city lights reflecting on the water, wondering why those conversations stayed in my mind longer than they should. My husband remained busy with his television work, traveling frequently and coming home late. We still cared for each other, yet our lives moved on parallel tracks that rarely crossed deeply anymore. When he talked about politics or Government briefings I listened politely while thinking about the next morning show or the messages from Balitazoli about program ideas. The distance between my marriage and my daily emotions grew slowly, almost invisibly, like the tide rising along the shore at night. One evening, after recording a special radio segment about financial literacy, Balitazoli suggested we walk along the coastal road before heading home. The air smelled of salt and the distant music from bars along the waterfront drifted through the warm darkness. We talked about the strange weight of responsibility that came with our jobs, how every statement could become news, how every silence could be interpreted. He admitted that leading an investigation agency often felt lonely because trust was rare in his word. I understood that feeling more than I expected. Radio hosts spend hours talking yet sometimes feel unheard in their own personal lives. As we walked, the lights of ships in the harbor shimmered like quiet witnesses to our conversation. At one point our hands brushed lightly and neither of us moved away immediately. The moment was brief, but it changed the atmosphere between us. After that night our meetings carried a different awareness. We still spoke about work, yet the pauses between words grew longer and our smiles lingered. I found myself choosing my outfits more carefully on days when I knew we would meet. He sometimes sent short messages about an article or a piece of music he had heard on the radio that reminded him of our conversations weeks past, and the tension between curiosity and caution built silently. We both knew the complicated reality surrounding us: my marriage, his public position, the small world of Malabo where rumors traveled faster than the ocean wind. Yet emotions rarely follow the logic of reputation. One late afternoon, after another planning session at the station, a sudden tropical storm began pouring rain over the city, forcing us to stay inside the building longer than expected. The corridors grew quiet as staff left early to avoid flooded streets. We ended up sitting in the dim studio where only the small red standby light glowed above the microphone. The silence felt different from our usual conversations. He spoke softly about how life sometimes pushes people toward unexpected crossroads, moments where the safe path and the honest path do not look the same. I listened, feeling the weight of his words and the echo of my own unspoken thoughts. When he reached for my hand, it was not dramatic or hurried, it was gentle and certain, as if acknowledging something that had been forming for months. The rain outside drummed against the roof while inside the studio the air felt warm and still. We stayed there talking quietly, sharing stories, fears, hopes, and the strange connection that had grown between us. That evening marked the moment when the boundary between professional friendship and something deeper finally disappeared. The city outside continued its restless movement, taxis splashing through puddles, music playing from distant bars, fishermen preparing for the night tide. Yet inside that small studio, time seemed to pause as two people realized they had stepped into a complicated and unexpected chapter of their lives. From that night onward, nothing felt entirely simple again. I continued hosting my morning radio program, greeting the city with energy and music while carrying a secret awareness beneath my calm voice. Balitazoli continued leading his agency, appearing in headlines and official meetings. And somewhere within the crowded, vibrant streets of Malabo, our hidden story moved quietly between responsibility, desire, and the unpredictable rhythm of the lives we had built. Working on radio in Malabo had already changed the direction of my life in ways I never expected, but the period when my connection with Balitazoli was at its strongest felt like stepping into a different world entirely, a world that existed quietly beside the normal routines of broadcasting schedules, newsroom meetings, and the ordinary rhythm of married life that I still pretended to maintain. At that time, our relationship had already grown beyond simple meetings for interviews or professional discussions. The early caution between us had slowly dissolved, and in its place there was a familiarity that felt powerful and dangerous at the same time. We spoke almost every day, sometimes about work, sometimes about nothing important at all, but the frequency of those conversations created a constant presence in my life that I could not ignore. Malabo itself seemed to carry the secret of our growing connection. The city is not large, and yet it feels full of hidden corners, cafes where journalists gather after work, quiet restaurants near the water, small roads that curve between government buildings and residential neighborhoods. In those places we created moments that belonged only to us, conversations that stretched late into the night while the warm coastal wind moved through the streets. Balitazoli had a way of speaking that mixed confidence with compassion, and when he looked at someone it felt as though he was studying more than their words. Perhaps that skill came from years of investigating financial secrets and understanding the motivations of people who tried to hide the truth behind complicated documents. But when he spoke with me, that intensity became something different. It felt like attention that was focused entirely on who I was rather than the public role I played. On the radio. There was one evening that stands out in my memory as the moment when the emotional balance between us shifted completely. We had met after my evening broadcast in a quiet restaurant overlooking the sea where the lights of ships flickered in the distance. The place was nearly empty because it was a weekday and most people in the city had already returned home. We had been talking for hours about our lives, our ambitions, and the strange pressures that came with being visible figures in a country where media and politics often intersected in complicated ways. At some point the conversation became more personal and he spoke about how lonely leadership could feel when everyone around you was either cautious or calculating. I remember leaning back in my chair listening to him while the distant sound of waves touched the shore. There was a sincerity in his voice that made the moment feel intimate even though we were sitting in a public place. Then he said something that I had not expected. He looked directly at me with a steady, thoughtful gaze and said that sometimes in life you meet someone who understands you in a way that makes everything else seem distant. He said that the time we spent together felt more genuine than many of the formal relationships that surrounded his work. I tried to respond casually, but my voice felt softer than usual. That was when he spoke the words that stayed in my mind long after that night ended. He said that if I chose to give him more of my time, if I allowed our connection to become a real part of my life rather than a hidden series of meetings, he would give me more of himself in return, not only affection but also support, opportunities, and a kind of security that few people could offer. He said that love and loyalty were not things he offered lightly, but when he decided to give them, he gave them completely. The way he said it was calm, almost matter of fact, as if he was describing a simple truth about how he lived his life, yet the meaning behind those words carried a weight that I felt immediately. In that moment I understood that he was not simply expressing feelings, he was inviting me into a deeper arrangement where our lives would become more connected than they already were. I remember looking out toward the dark water for a few seconds. Before answering, part of me felt nervous because I knew the complexity of what he was suggesting. I was still married and my public image as a respected radio presenter depended on maintaining a certain appearance of stability and professionalism. But another part of me felt drawn toward the intensity of his attention and the promise of a relationship that seemed full of passion and possibility. The truth is that my marriage had already become quiet and distant long before that evening. My husband and I had grown accustomed to living beside each other rather than truly sharing our lives. We respected each other, yet the warmth that once defined our relationship had slowly faded beneath years of demanding careers and constant public scrutiny. When Baltazar spoke about giving more time to each other, it awakened a feeling that had been dormant in my life. For a long time, the feeling of being desired and valued not only as a professional voice on the radio but as a woman with dreams and emotions. So I began spending more time with him. At first it happened gradually: an extra dinner here, a longer conversation there, a weekend afternoon meeting that stretched into evening. Each moment felt natural, yet when I looked back I realized that my schedule was slowly reorganizing itself around his presence. My mornings were still dedicated to the radio station where I greeted listeners with music, news and lively conversation, but once the microphone was off my thoughts often drifted toward the messages he might send or the next moment we would share. He began introducing me to parts of his world that few people saw. Sometimes he invited me to quiet gatherings with trusted colleagues where discussions about finance policy and international relations continued late into the night. Other times he simply wanted to escape the seriousness of his work and walk along the waterfront talking about music, literature and the strange unpredictability of life. He kept his promise about generosity as well, not in ways that felt like crude displays of wealth but in gestures that made it clear he wanted to take care of me. He sent flowers to the radio station once after a particularly difficult week when my program had faced criticism from a political figure. Another time he surprised me with tickets for a cultural event that I had mentioned wanting to attend months earlier. He seemed to remember every small detail of my interests and preferences. Those gestures, combined with the emotional intensity of our conversations, created a powerful sense of attachment that grew stronger each week. Looking back now, I can describe it honestly: I became addicted to the feeling of being around him, not addicted in a simple physical sense but in the emotional way that certain relationships can take hold of your thoughts. When he called, my mood lifted immediately. When days passed without seeing him, I felt restless, as if something important was missing from my routine. My world slowly divided itself into two realities: the public life where I remained the cheerful radio presenter, and the private world where my connection with Baltazar filled my thoughts and shaped my decisions. He also spoke more openly about the future during that time. He said that life was too short to live inside half commitments. He believed that people who truly cared for each other should not be afraid to build something meaningful together even when circumstances were complicated. Sometimes his words sounded like promises, sometimes like challenges, asking me whether I was willing to step fully into the relationship we were creating. And each time I found myself moving closer to him rather than pulling away. Malabo continued to move around us with its usual energy. The markets remained crowded, the harbor remained busy, and the media world continued producing stories that filled newspapers and television screens. Yet within that busy environment, our relationship became a quiet current beneath the surface. A few close friends at the station began to suspect that something had changed in my life because they noticed how often I seemed thoughtful or distracted between broadcasts. But no one knew the full truth. Balitazali understood the need for discretion better than anyone. His position leading a major investigation agency meant that every aspect of his life could become a subject of speculation if handled carelessly. So we protected our privacy carefully, choosing where to meet and how to move through the city without attracting attention. Despite those precautions, the emotional intensity between us continued to grow. Every conversation seemed to deepen our connection. Every shared experience added another layer to the sense that our lives had become intertwined. I began to realize that the promise he had made that evening in the restaurant had already begun shaping my decisions more than I had expected. I was giving him more of my time, more of my attention, more of my emotional energy. And in return, he was giving me affection, support, and a sense of importance that felt powerful and intoxicating. At that stage of our story, I did not think about the long-term consequences. I did not analyze the risks or the fragile balance between my public image and my private choices. All I felt was the immediacy of the connection we shared and the thrill of living inside a secret that only we understood. That period became the height of our relationship, a time when every meeting carried excitement and every message felt meaningful. The world outside continued moving forward with its usual speed, but within the space we created together, time seemed to slow, allowing us to explore a bond that had begun unexpectedly inside a radio studio and grown into something far more consuming than either of us had originally planned. Working on radio in Malabo had already filled my life with noise, voices, music, and constant movement, but the day everything finally collapsed into reality began quietly, like any other morning in the city. The sun rose slowly over the Gulf of Guinea, casting pale gold light across the streets, and the familiar sounds of taxis, engines, vendors calling out, and distant waves created the rhythm that always accompanied my early commute to the station. Inside the studio, nothing felt unusual at first. The red light above the microphone turned on, and I greeted listeners with the same confident voice they had known for years. I introduced the morning music, spoke about the day's headlines, and laughed with callers who shared stories about traffic and weather. To anyone listening, I sounded exactly the same as always, calm, energetic, and fully in control of the broadcast. Yet beneath that voice, my life had already become tangled in secrets that were growing heavier every week. My relationship with Balitazali had reached a stage where the distance between private emotion and public responsibility was becoming impossible to maintain without tension. We had grown deeply attached to each other, and the time we spent together had increased until it shaped almost every part of my schedule outside the station. Even so, we continued believing that careful planning and discretion would keep our story hidden from the world around us. Balitazali understood reputation better than most people in the country. His position as the leader of the National Financial Investigation Agency had turned him into a powerful and widely respected figure. He was known for his intelligence, discipline, and quiet strength. People spoke about him with a mixture of admiration and caution because his work often exposed secrets that others tried desperately to hide. For that reason, he guarded his personal life carefully. Whenever we met, he chose locations where attention would be minimal, and he always reminded me that patience and discretion were necessary if we wanted our connection to survive for a long time. That strategy worked. Malabo is a city where rumors travel quickly, yet somehow our relationship remained a quiet current flowing beneath the surface of public life. My husband remained absorbed in his work at the national television station, traveling frequently and spending long evenings preparing reports or attending official briefings. The distance between us had grown so gradually that neither of us spoke about it directly. We simply continued moving through our routines as if the silence between us was normal. But silence rarely lasts forever. The day everything changed happened several months after the period when my relationship with Balitazali had reached its strongest intensity. One remembered the air that afternoon being unusually warm even for Malabo, the kind of heavy humidity that makes the sky appear pale and motionless. Balitazali had asked me to meet him at a private apartment that belonged to a friend of his who was Often traveling abroad, it was one of the few places where we could spend time together without worrying about journalists, photographers, or curious acquaintances recognizing us. I had hesitated slightly when he suggested the meeting because my husband had returned from a trip earlier than expected the previous night, but he seemed busy preparing a television report and I assumed he would remain at the newsroom for most of the day. So I convinced myself that the risk was small. The apartment was located in a quiet neighborhood not far from the coast, surrounded by tall palm trees and white buildings that looked almost identical to each other. When I arrived, Balitazoli was already there waiting near the window with the calm, confident posture that always defined him. He smiled when he saw me and the tension of the day seemed to soften immediately. We talked for a long time that afternoon about everything from politics to music to the strange paths our lives had taken since we first met inside the radio studio. There was a feeling of comfort between us that had grown through months of shared moments and quiet promises. At one point he repeated something he had said before, that the connection between us was real and that in his life he rarely allowed anyone to come so close to his private world. Hearing those words again reminded me how deeply I had become involved with him. The hours passed quickly until suddenly the calm atmosphere of the apartment shattered with a sharp knock on the door. At first we both assumed it was a neighbor or perhaps a building manager, but the knock came again, louder and more urgent. Something about the sound created an immediate sense of dread in my chest. Balitazoli walked toward the door cautiously while I remained frozen near the center of the room. When he opened it, the silence that followed felt heavier than any noise. Standing in the doorway was my husband. For several seconds no one spoke. The three of us simply looked at each other inside that narrow space where the truth had arrived without warning. My husband's expression was not loud or explosive the way dramatic stories often describe moments of discovery. Instead, it was quiet and controlled, which somehow made the situation feel even more intense. He had already understood everything the moment he saw us together. Later I learned that a colleague at the television station had mentioned seeing me entering the building earlier that afternoon, and curiosity had led him to follow that small thread of suspicion until it brought him directly to the apartment. The confrontation that followed unfolded slowly like a scene moving through heavy air. My husband asked only a few questions, but the meaning behind them was clear. He did not shout, he did not accuse with wild anger. Instead, he spoke in the steady tone of a journalist who had just confirmed a difficult story. Balitazoli remained composed during the entire moment. His posture never changed and his voice stayed calm when he acknowledged that the situation was complicated. Yet even in that tense silence, it was obvious that he was aware of the larger consequences surrounding his public reputation. My husband looked at both of us for a long moment before speaking again. He said that trust once broken could not simply be repaired with explanations. Then he turned and walked away without another word. The door closed behind him, leaving the apartment filled with an echoing silence. I remember sitting down slowly, feeling the weight of what had just happened pressing against my chest. Everything that had existed in secret between Balitazoli and me had suddenly been exposed to the one person whose discovery would cause the deepest damage. For a while neither of us spoke. Finally Balitazoli moved closer and placed a steady hand on my shoulder. He said that moments like this were inevitable whenever lives become entangled in complicated ways, but he also reminded me that his position in the country required extreme caution. He was respected not only for his intelligence but also for the strength of character people believed he possessed. If the details of our relationship became public, they would not simply damage personal reputations, they could create political complications that neither of us truly wanted. Within days, the consequences of that discovery began unfolding. My husband requested a formal separation and soon afterward announced his intention to divorce. Because he was also a public figure within the national media, the news spread quietly among journalists and colleagues before eventually reaching wider circles. Yet even as the story moved through whispers and speculation, one important detail remained strangely absent from public discussion. The name of Balitazoli was never mentioned openly. His reputation as a powerful and respected leader created a kind of protective silence around him. People may have suspected the truth, but very few were willing to speak it directly. Balitazoli himself handled the situation with the same controlled discipline that defined his professional life. He insisted that our connection must remain completely private from that moment forward. Not because he denied caring about me, but because the stability of his position and the trust the country placed in him depended on maintaining a certain image of strength and integrity. In the weeks that followed, I continued working at the radio station, trying to maintain the same confident voice that listeners expected each morning. Yet inside, my personal life had shifted dramatically. My marriage was ending, my reputation within Certain circles had become uncertain, and the relationship that had once felt intoxicating now existed under a heavy cloud of secrecy. Balitozoli remained present in my life, but the nature of our connection had changed. Where once there had been open excitement, now there was careful distance and quiet understanding. He was still the strong, respected figure that many people admired across the country, and because of that strength he kept our story hidden from public view, protecting his position, while the consequences of our choices reshaped the direction of my own life in ways I could never fully predict.